The Sky Father frowned, and the great king's throne shattered into jagged bronze shards. Every city from the Nile to the Aegean burned in a single heartbeat. You were taught this took centuries, but the hidden truth is much darker. Long ago, before the iron sword sang its cold song, the world was bound in a web of shimmering gold and deep blue lapis lazuli. The masters of the ancient world believed their dominion was as eternal as the rising stars, never suspecting that the very gods who elevated them were preparing to wipe the slate clean. In that distant age, the Great Green Sea was not a barrier, but a bridge. A shimmering path where ships... Imagine a world where a pharaoh in Memphis wore a pectoral of Afghan lapis, and a Hittite king in Hattusa toasted his victories with wine from the sun-drenched hills of Canaan. This was the Golden Web, a delicate tapestry of trade and tribute woven by the gods themselves to keep the chaos of the outer darkness at bay. From the palatial heights of Mycenae, where the Wanax ruled with an ivory scepter, to the bustling docks of Ugarit, every soul was part of a grand machine, fueled by the marriage of copper from Cyprus and tin from the far-off mountains of the east. They called it the Bronze Age, an era of giants where the earth provided. But this prosperity was a fragile illusion, a house of cards built on the backs of deities who were growing restless with human pride. The great kings, the sun kings of Hatti and the divine pharaohs of Egypt, communicated in a language of brotherhood and gold, writing letters on clay tablets that spoke of eternal peace. They believed that because they held the keys to the grain stores and the bronze foundries, they held the keys to time itself. The chariots of this age were the heavy engines of their era, rolling across the dusty plains of the Levant in a display of power that seemed destined to last until the world ended. Yet, this interconnected world was so perfectly tuned that the removal of a single gear would cause the entire mechanism of humanity to grind into dust. The gods were watching, and they were ready to cut the threads. The sky, once a canopy of sapphire that promised life, turned into a lid of burning brass. The gods of the storm, Teshub of the Hittites and the mighty Baal of the Levant, had closed their mouths, refusing to breathe the cooling rains onto the thirsty fields. For 3 long centuries, the clouds became ghosts, drifting over the parched plateaus of Anatolia and the rugged hills of the Peloponnese without shedding a single tear. This was no passing season of hardship. It was a divine abandonment that withered the very soul of the Eastern world. In the great city of Hattusa, the great king climbed the high altars, his golden robes heavy with the scent of sacrifice, to plead with the silent heavens. But his voice was swallowed by the hot, dry winds that swept across the salt-cracked earth. The redistributive pulse of the palaces, that rhythmic heartbeat which had for generations fed every mouth from the humble farmer to the elite charioteer, began to falter. When the grain silos of the Hittite sun kings turned to dust, the golden web of the world began to unravel. Then, as if the drought were not enough to break the spirit of man, the earth itself revolted. It was a storm of earthquakes, a divine tantrum that shook the foundations of the world for 50 violent years. Walls built by the legendary Cyclopes at Mycenae and Tiryns, stones so massive they seemed immovable by mortal hands, cracked like dry parchment. The people watched in horror as their sacred shrines crumbled into the dust, seeing in the falling masonry a sign that the gods had not only left them, but were in Egypt. The Nile, the eternal river of life, began to ebb, its floods no longer sufficient to wash away the salt of despair. The pharaoh, the living Horus on earth, found his divinity challenged not by a foreign army, but by the hollow eyes of his starving subjects. Every link in the great chain of the Mediterranean was under strain, and as the famine sharpened the desperation of the masses, the social order that had endured for 1,000 years began to rot from within. The sky was ash, the ground was a trap, and the silence of the gods, everything they believed up to this point, was wrong. From the churning foam of the great green, A new kind of shadow began to stretch across the sun-drenched sands of the Levant. These were not the disciplined charioteers of the great kings, but a terrifying confederation of the displaced. A phantom tide. They came like a fever. The Peliset with their plumed headdresses, the horned Shurden, the Luca, the Tersha, and the Shekelesh. Men who had forgotten the names of their own gods, because their gods had forgotten to send the rain. They did not come to conquer and rule. They came to consume and survive, carrying their wives, their children, and their iron-tipped desperation in the bellied hulls of high-prowed ships. In the great merchant city of Ugarit, the air grew thick with the scent of salt and impending ash. King Amurapi, the final sovereign of that glittering coastal jewel, looked out from his palace windows and saw a horizon bristling with hostile masts. His letters, preserved by the very fires that would eventually destroy his archives, are the haunting threnody of a world ending. My father, he wrote to the king of Alatia on the island of Cyprus, his voice trembling across the distance of 3,000 years. Behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. My own troops and chariots are in the Hittite land, and my ships are in Lycia. Thus, the country is abandoned to itself. And that's when the real question emerged. The kings of the earth were watching their borders dissolve like salt in a rising tide, yet why did they all? Long before the final fire, Pharaoh Merneptah had warned of these wanderers, recording his first victory against a coalition of northerners in the 5th year of his reign. But his successors would find no such respite. From the burning ramparts of his Anatolian strongholds, Shuppiluliuma II, the last sun king of the Hittites, saw the smoke of his vassal cities rising like a sacrificial offering to a silent sky. At the edge of the world, in the halls of the 20th dynasty, Pharaoh Ramesses III prepared for a collision that would define the fate of the Nile, facing the same northerners in their isles who had already extinguished the light of Ugarit. The golden web of trade and ritual that had bound the Mediterranean together for centuries was being torn apart by these ghosts from the Great Green. Every messenger brought word of another palace reduced to a blackened shell, another granary looted, another lineage of kings erased from the memory of man. The terror was not merely in the violence, but in the sudden, chilling realization that the gods of the Bronze Age were silent, and the world was now governed by the iron laws of the hungry. Through the charcoal-stained ruins of Pylos and Tiryns, the archaeologists of later ages would find the specifically crafted arrowheads of the sea peoples embedded deep in the charred wood, silent witnesses to the final screams of a "Save us!" A priest in a falling city might have cried to the smoke-filled heavens, for the sea has finally come to claim what the land can no longer feed. In the high, wind-swept heart of Anatolia, the great king Shuppiluliuma II stood upon the jagged ramparts of Hattusa, the city of 1,000 gods. For generations, the Hittite sun kings had ruled with an iron-willed diplomacy and chariots that shook the very foundations of the earth. But the sun was finally setting on the land of Hatti, the veins of the world, those secret winding paths that brought tin from the jagged mountains of the Far East and copper from the salt-sprayed shores of Alatia. Without these two sacred metals, the bronze that defined their age could no longer be born in the crucibles of the palace. The great furnaces grew cold, and the king looked out to see not the glint of his invincible armies, but the black smoke of his own border forts drifting like ghost banners across the horizon. "Is this the end of the eternal pact?" he whispered to the storm god Teshub, but the gods remained silent as the heavy gates of Hattusa were barred for the final time. The Hittites did not fall to a single conqueror's blade. They suffocated as the lifeblood of international trade. They abandoned their massive stone capital, leaving their secret archives to the dust and the encroaching flame, vanishing into the rugged hills as if they had never bridged. Simultaneously, across the wine-dark reaches of the Aegean, the golden halls of the Mycenaean Wanax, in the fortress cities of Mycenae, Tiryns, and the coastal jewel of Pylos, the warrior lords who claimed direct descent from the gods found that their divine blood could not. These were men of the bronze spear and the lion gate, master administrators of a complex redistributive machine where every single grain of wheat and every jar of fragrant oil was meticulously recorded in the rhythmic, linear scratches of the scribes. But the machine had seized. As the great palaces burned, some under the onslaught of the northerners and others by the torches of their own desperate, hungry subjects, the very memory of how to read and write was devoured by the inferno. The scribes fell where they stood, their clay tablets baked into permanent stone by the fires of their own destruction. In a single violent generation, the masters of the Aegean were reduced to shadows and folktales. The bronze scales fell from the eyes of the survivors, and they looked upon a landscape where the only metal left to master was the cold, stubborn iron that lay buried beneath the earth, waiting for a harder, darker age to begin. The Age of Heroes ended not with a triumphant song, but with the deafening. In the wake of the fire came a silence that lasted for generations, a heavy, suffocating quiet, where once the world had rung with the sound of bronze. The great archives of the Wanax at Pylos and the Sun Kings of Hattusa were not merely burned, they were forgotten. The ink dried in the wells, and the capacity to record the names of gods and the lineages of kings vanished from the human mind. For 400 years, the Eastern Mediterranean drifted in a starless night of history, an era we now call the Dark Age. The intricate golden web that had bound the pharaoh to the Hittite great king was severed, replaced by a world that was smaller, colder, and far more lethal. Men no longer looked to the distant horizon for ships carrying tin from the far west or copper from the heart of Cyprus. They looked instead to the red earth beneath their feet. From the embers of the collapse, a new metal was born. Iron was not a gift from the diplomatic marriages of kings. It was a common, stubborn ore that required a fiercer fire and a harder heart to forge. While bronze was the jewelry of the elite, iron became the tool of the many, democratizing both the plow and the sword. It was in this iron silence that the survivors began to stitch together. Around flickering hearths, the children of the refugees told stories of a vanished age of heroes, where men walked with gods and fought for 10 years over the honor of a single queen. These whispers eventually crystallized into the epic traditions of the Iliad and the Odyssey, preserved by the oral poets who refused to let the. Beyond the charred ruins of the palaces, the power vacuum allowed for the rise of the daring. The merchant sailors of Phoenicia began to spread a simpler script, an alphabet that could be learned by a commoner rather than a sheltered scribe, while the Peliset settled on the Canaanite coast to become the Philistines of legend. Even the Israelites began to carve their own identity in the Judean hills, free at last from the shadow of the Egyptian tax collector. But the ruins of the Bronze Age remained as a jagged warning, a reminder that the more interconnected our world becomes, the more fragile it grows. The ghosts of the sea peoples still whisper in the wind that rustles through the dry grass of Hattusa, warning us that when the rains fail and the trade routes break, even the greatest we are but tenants in the palaces of the gods, and the thread that holds our civilization together is thinner than we dare to believe. The ancient stories still speak to us. Subscribe to hear. Tell us in the comments.
Hey, Ananeta. Ora hundo to.